Welcome to everyone in Dnipro. I hope you can hear me. I'm Nigel Wheatley. Welcome from Wakefield in central England. Big welcome to everyone in Dnipro, everyone who's watching on the live feed, and big shout out to the people who are listening in New Zealand, where it's 20 to 2 in the morning at the moment. Thank you very much for joining us. Today I'd like to talk to you about quality assurance in translation, and I'd like to talk to you about it from the perspective of the individual freelancer, not necessarily from the perspective of a larger translation company or agency. I know there is a lot of agency representatives here, but I really want to talk about it from the point of view of the individual. Representation in our profession as being something bureaucratic for very little return. Hold on, we don't seem to have the slides here. So, other with quality assurance, poor reputation in our profession as being bureaucratic. There are two. I think we have to look at this as two big psychological problems that freelance translators repeatedly run into. First is imposter syndrome. Svetlana Bregman has spoken at some length on Tuesday about imposter syndrome in interpreting, and it's something I've come across frequently in translators as well. It's a feeling that we're not good enough to be doing the work that we're doing or to take on better work, and the fear that somehow we'll be found out. There's another big psychological problem that we've got, and that's the famous Dunning-Kruger effect. That's the impression that we know everything just because we know a little bit about something. Whereas really where we want to be is somewhere in the middle. We want to be in between those two extremes, where we have a healthy respect for what we know and what we can do, but also for what we don't know, what is beyond our capabilities. That's how we can ensure that we can provide a quality service. It's not simply a professional, as Svetlana pointed out, it's also for the good of our own mental health, to be able to be proud of what we're doing professionally. It's also a question of assuring our potential clients that we provide a quality service. Quality assurance can be a way of differentiating yourself from other translators. So it's a way of getting more work, better paid work. I'm not saying quality assurance is equally important in all types of translation. It's most important in highly regulated industries, such as pharmaceuticals, the automotive industry, aerospace. So when the consequences of mistranslation are particularly high, such as in medical translation, in patents, or some forms of legal and financial translation. These are often documents that are very valuable to the client, worth a lot of money, and so they can and they should command a premium rate for translation. On the other hand, quality assurance is maybe less important in sworn translation because there is an external quality assurance in most countries which have a system of official sworn translators. Transcreation, literary translation, again, maybe quality assurance is, formal quality assurance is less important. Between those two extremes, you've got work for in-house work and work for agencies, somewhere in between. You might have some protection with external quality assurance, but you still don't want to be delivering bad work. But what do we actually mean by quality? Savary illustrated the problem well more than about 50 years ago now. And depending on who you listen to, it's important that translation gives the words of the source text, and or it's important that it gives the ideas of the source text. A translation, depending on who you listen to, should read like an original work, or it should read like a translation. Should it reflect the style of the original? But then it's an original intellectual work of the translator, so surely it should also possess the style of the translator. Should it read as a contemporary of the original, or should it read as a contemporary text at the time the translation was made? There are many, many problems in defining what you want to get out of your translation. The list could go on. Now, I'm not going to go through all of these. This is an excellent book on translation quality assessment by Julianne House, and it goes through, the first third of the book, in fact, goes through the various different approaches that have been used to assess quality in translation. I just really want to illustrate the number of different definitions of translation quality that are possible. Now, we're usually working in a commercial environment here. We're often referring to quality management under the ISO standards. And ISO 9000 defines quality as the totality of features and characteristics of a product or service that bear upon its ability to satisfy stated or implied needs. Now, that's a little bit of ISO speak, so I'm going to adapt that for the purposes of this presentation. I'm going to say that quality in translation is the suitability of a translation for a given purpose. In commercial translation, at least, we're not translating for fun, and we're not at university anymore. Each of our translations has a purpose for the client, otherwise nobody would bother paying us. And translator needs to understand what that purpose is, because different types of translation are more suitable than other types for the various purposes that our translations are used for. Now, before I talk you through a practical example of quality assurance in translation, there are still a couple of terms I want to clear up. In particular, the difference between quality control, or QC, and quality assurance, which is QA. Now, I'm a medical translator, so I'm a bit of a stickler for correct terminology. Now, I would have thought that all translators are the same, but I often hear, especially translation agencies, getting these two mixed up. They tell me, make sure you run a QA check before you deliver. And I'm on the screen, that's not a QA check. The clue is in the name. If it's a check, it's quality control. And the formal definition is a part of quality management focused on fulfilling quality requirements. Now, translate that into English. It's all the tests or the checks that you do on a given product or service to make sure it meets some predefined specification. You're hoping that the specification is an accurate reflection of what the client actually wants. And that's not always the case, but that's the best you can do. You have to work to some sort of specification. Otherwise, what are you checking against? Quality assurance, on the other hand, is a part of quality management focused on providing confidence that quality requirements will be fulfilled. Now, it's this bit providing confidence that I like to focus on in this definition. So it comes back to our slide, why bother with quality assurance? You need to have confidence in your own work, otherwise you're going to be a pretty miserable translator. You need to inspire confidence in your potential clients, otherwise they'll choose a different translator. But what's this quality management thing? Well, it's a concept that runs through a large series of international standards, not just standards issued by the ISO. It wasn't invented by the ISO, but they've been very enthusiastic about taking it on. And in basic terms, a business has a quality management system, which is made up of four parts, four types of operation: quality planning, quality assurance, quality control, and quality improvement. I'd like to talk about quality management in terms of three questions, really, that I hope are relevant for freelance translators. Firstly, what's my definition of quality? We've seen that there are lots of different ways of defining translation quality. Fine, but you're going to have to choose one of them, and you're going to have to choose a definition of quality that works for you. It might not be the same as mine. It might not be the same as somebody else's. That's fine. We're a big profession, we can cope with that. As long as it works for you and your clients and you can justify it, that's okay. You do need to think about what you're aiming for, because you need to think about how you can make sure you're providing that quality. I put down process analysis here, which is a bit of a fancy term. What it means is thinking about what you do professionally, what you do well, and what maybe you don't do so well. and trying to find ways to do the bits you're not so good at a little bit better. I think this is the part that really brings the return for an individual freelance translator in terms of improving their professional practice and the service they're providing to their clients. Finally, all professional translators and professional interpreters here, we all have clients, otherwise we'd starve. And so we all have to convince potential clients that we provide them with a quality service. The important thing I'd like to emphasize here is that you don't have to design a full quality management system if you don't think that's appropriate for you and your business. I'm going to spend most of the rest of this presentation talking you through one model of a quality management system. But that is to give you the ideas of the kinds of things you could do. I'm not saying you must do everything that's on all the rest of the slides, but I want to give you an idea of what other people think is important in translation quality management so that you can choose the bits that you focus on. If you want to chat about that in your promotional material on your website, go for it. At the end of the presentation, I'll come back to discussing a few ways that you can promote your quality management system or whatever quality assurance you are doing. Now, there are lots of quality management standards in the language services industry. I'm going to go through these slides very quickly just to give you an idea of the variety. In translation, of course, we have ISO 17100, but we also have ISO 18587 for post-editing of machine translation output, which is not translation. There's also an ASM standard, which is popular in the automotive industry. There's general guidelines for translation projects from the ISO, and there's a brand new ISO standard for legal translations that came out this year. It's a bit controversial, so I'm not going to discuss that any further today. There are also quality management standards in interpreting, both general interpreting, community interpreting, and simultaneous interpreting, and also for terminology work, if anyone here is specialised in terminology. An array of standards there, but I'm basically a translator, so I'm going to discuss ISO 17100 as a model for quality management systems in the language service industries. As I said before, you don't have to follow every last detail of ISO 17100 unless your aim is to be 100% fully compliant. You can have a quality management system or a quality assurance system that is perfectly good for your business without following ISO 17100. I think it's important to give a practical example that's as relevant as I can, as relevant as I can make it to as large a number of people as possible. ISO 17100 doesn't apply to interpreting because there are other standards that apply to interpreting, and importantly, it doesn't apply to post-editing machine translation output because that is not considered to be translation. The standard gives a wide range of definitions so that we can be clear about what we're talking about. These are some of the possible translation services that could be offered. You've got translation itself, you've got revision, you've got monolingual review, and you've got proofreading. Now, note that revision and proofreading are not the same thing. Some of my clients, usually the ones who don't know the difference between quality control and quality assurance, don't seem to know the difference between revision and proofreading. But it's a quick way of telling if you're working with a good professional agency. Yeah, I'm talking to any agency reps who are listening in here. You can tell if you're working with a good professional agency if they know the difference between revision and proofreading. One term that causes a lot of confusion is language service provider, or LSP. Now, the standard is categorical that a language service provider can be an individual person. So don't think when you're talking about LSPs that has to be a translation company or a translation agency. It doesn't. You don't have to be an agency to fall under the definition. And a translation service provider is simply a language service provider that provides translation services. And we've got two common situations here, either working through an agency or working directly with direct clients, directly with the end clients. In these diagrams, everyone apart from the end client, is a language service provider. Indeed, is a translation service provider. Now, sorry, I should have said this as a trigger word for some people in the profession. Resources, pet hate word. Let's have a little bit of a look at what's behind this in the standard. You've got human resources, and that's basically you. Your qualifications are the qualifications that you thought that you should have. Competences are the competencies that you thought that you should have. And those competencies need to be maintained and updated through CPD events such as this one. And then there are the technical and technological resources that you need to have, or at least you need to have access to. You've probably seen this list of qualifications in requests for collaboration from agencies. The standard says that translators and revisers should have a degree in translation, or they should have a degree in some other field plus 2 years of experience, or they should have 5 years of experience in translation. This list is a little bit controversial because it doesn't mention certification, it doesn't mention membership of professional organisations. So you might want to say that your own qualifications are a bit better than this. That's your business. That's your business, your marketing. And then there's the list of competences. Again, you can find other lists of competencies that translators should have that are equally valid as this one, and for professional purposes. I quite like this list that is in ISO 17100 because it recognises that being a good translator is more than simply being able to competently translate from one language to another. You need to be able to write in your target language, and you need to be able to understand the meaning of the source language. You need to be able to research, acquire information, and process that information through to producing the target text. You need to know about the culture that you're dealing with, the source culture and the target culture. You need to be technically competent. You need to be able to work a computer these days. I don't think anyone is translating on typewriters anymore. And you need to know something about the field that you're working in. Otherwise, you're going to make some. I'm a medical translator. You should see some of the stuff that I get to revise. You need to know about the meaning of the text, and that includes the background to what you're translating. Now, I've been saying translators and revisers. I know under the standard these must be two different people. The reviser is expected to have the same qualifications and competencies as the translator. And on top of that, they're expected to have translation and or revision experience in the field in question, in the domain in question. So out of the two, ISO 17100 says that it should be the reviser who's the more qualified and or the more experienced. Does that always happen? I'm not going to comment. Review under ISO is a monolingual task, so the competencies of the reviewers are basically knowledge and experience in the subject matter that is being translated. Now, it might seem like common sense, but all these competencies need to be maintained and updated. It's not enough to have a certificate that was issued 20 years ago and assume that that gives you a license to earn money. Within the system of ISO standards, this is the concept of continual improvement, where the objective is not simply to do something adequately, but to get better at doing it over time. For translators, this is where CPD, continuing professional development, comes in. In the standard, it doesn't specify any specific amounts of CPD or any method for accreditation. That is something that is left up to each individual person or their professional bodies. Certain professional bodies have standards for that. However, there is a requirement to keep a record of the activity that you consider to be CPD. And this standard has been around for 5 years now. I'm quite surprised that I'm not asked for my CP record more often. But I think this is something that will be developing as the accreditations come through, but more and more people will be asking, well, what have you done in terms of CPD over the last year, the last 2 years? Are you up to date with your skills? In terms of technical and technological resources, these are mostly fairly simple. I'm running a bit low on time, but I'll try and go even quicker. All of these are fairly obvious and uncontroversial, but it's an area you might want to look at in terms of developing your business. Is your technical equipment adequate? Do you have the information resources you need? That sort of question. We're almost ready to start translation here. Not quite. According to the standard, there are still some things we have to do. Inquiry comes in from a potential client and you have to decide whether it's even possible that you can do it. Then you've got to issue a quotation. We're going to assume that your quotation is accepted and leads to an agreement between the client and the TSB, who is you. Often we call that a purchase order. The agreement can take all sorts of forms, but it's important in terms of the standard that it's in writing and you have a record of what you've agreed. And I've followed the order in the standard. Most people think project-related information should come a little bit earlier up on this list. What it means is knowing who to go to if you've got queries. Then there's the preparation of the project. Anything else that you feel you need to do before you start translating. Analysing the source text, preparing it in your CAT tool, any terminology you need, any style guides you need, any reference materials you need. And then finally, you're going to need to keep some records in case there are problems, simply so you know who to invoice and how much. This is the overview of the production process. You've got translation, you've got checking with the translator, that's fairly obvious. The standard says that you have to have revision by a second person, that can't be done by the translator. Review and proofreading in practice are quite rare, but they're optional, they can be there if needed. And then there's a final verification and release by the person who's taking legal responsibility for the translation. Alas, when I talk about ISO 17100 to other translators, they often complain it says nothing about how to produce a quality translation, or even what a quality translation actually is. I've given you my definition of a quality translation. That's a translation that is suitable for a predefined purpose. It's deliberately quite close to the definition in the international standard, which says that translator shall translate in accordance with the purpose of the translation project, including the linguistic conventions of the target language and relevant project specifications. It also says the translator should provide a service conforming to this international standard with regards to the following: semantic accuracy. So the target text should mean the same as the source text. Remember, the people who drafted this standard felt they had to specify that. That is how bad some translations are. They mean something completely different from the source text. You also need appropriate syntax, spelling, punctuation, etc. And everything else that says the translation should be competently written in the target language. You need lexical cohesion and phraseology. So be appropriate for the purpose of the text. Compliance with specific domain and client terminology in any style guide. Don't forget that the same word can mean different things to different people. There's a look at the target audience, the purpose of the target language content, formatting, if it's specified or implied in the project specification. There's also 2 more steps in the production process. I don't think anyone is going to suggest that translators shouldn't check their work before they deliver it. They also make revision obligatory. The reviser can make corrections or recommend corrections depending on the agreement between the reviser and whoever has contracted them. And when it says corrections, that can mean a complete retranslation. Standard, we're almost finished through with the standard now, so I'm a little short on time. There are a couple more things. Post-production processes. First of these is client feedback. Was the client satisfied? Was there anything they could do? I mean, I'm not pretending that the every client is wonderful. Obviously not. There are some very unreasonable clients out there, but do we really want a client who's unhappy at the end of the project, or would it be better to adjust things in the process so that we can avoid problems later on? The final clause of the standard is labeled closing administration. You've got archiving, and it's not actually in the standard, but I would add here invoicing and ensuring your invoice gets. So we're almost finished. I'd just like to talk a little bit about compliance, which with ISO 7 or any other formal standard that you might choose. A lot of people think standards are meaningless to them just because they don't intend to get certified. So what's the point? But certification is only one of the options available. Simplest approach is just to say that you're compliant with your publicity material on your website. That can work. At least it shows that you're aware of the standard. But be prepared to justify that you're compliant if anyone asks you. Otherwise, you can get into legal problems for advertising, things like that. Not to mention the ethical issues involved of basically lying. There is something in the ISO series of standards to make a more formal declaration of conformity to the standard. This is something I occasionally do for clients in the pharmaceutical industry. And then there's certification, which is quite expensive. That's a four-figure sum in euros, and an awful lot of time and effort. But if you really want to go for it, then that is a possibility. LICS is the Language Industry Certification Scheme, and they certify individuals as well as translation companies. So to finish off with a few practical considerations. Yes, ISO quality management systems are very bureaucratic. You get diminishing returns from each layer of investment. But so the more complicated you make your quality management system, the less. Each time you make it more complicated, you're going to get less and less back. So try and keep it as simple as you can. As I say, they are very bureaucratic. ISO quality systems are very bureaucratic, and nobody's actually forcing you to use ISO 17100. You can have a simpler system if you want one, if you think that is what is better for your business. And just my opinion here, the greatest gain I think an individual freelance translator will have comes from analysing what you are doing in the process, from setting up your office, from dealing with inquiries through the translation process, onto making sure your translation is revised if that's appropriate, and then on through checking that the client is happy, checking that you get paid. Looking at what you are doing in practice and seeing what you can improve. Finally, just to remember that quality assurance is cumulative. It's an incremental process. What you're aiming for is continual improvement in quality, not just a one-off jump and then forget about it. It is something that goes on and on throughout your professional life and throughout your career. So thank you. Thank you for listening. I hope I've given you some ideas for moving forward in your quality management. I don't know if we've had any time for questions, but I will be in the Zoom room later on, and these are my contact details. So feel free to get in touch. Thank you again.